The first scream came just as the dessert plates were being set down, thin and strangled, as though it had been caught halfway between the throat and the truth. By the time anyone moved, the time-chairs scraped, glasses trembled, and eyes darted toward the head of the table. Mr. Alistair Pembroke was already dead. He sat upright, unnaturally composed, his fingers still curled around the stem of a crystal glass. The candlelight flickered against his pale face, exaggerating the stillness, turning it into something theatrical. Only the dark stain spreading across the white linen beneath him betrayed the violence that had occurred. A single wound, precise and clean, just below the ribcage. No weapon in sight. The dining room itself seemed almost to mock the chaos. The long mahogany table was polished to perfection, the silverware aligned with military precision, the high-backed chairs occupied moments ago by laughter, conversation, and the quiet, calculated lies of polite society. Now, those same guests stood frozen, each one watching the others with growing suspicion. There were 8 of them in total, including the victim. 7 now remained. Lady Margaret Pembroke, pale but composed, pressed a trembling handkerchief to her lips. "It's impossible," she whispered, though whether she spoke to herself or the room, no one could tell. No one left the table. And that was the dreadful truth of it. Not one of them had stood. Not during the final course, not during the toast, not even in the moment before the scream. The servants had entered only once, to place the desserts, and they had left just as quickly under Lady Margaret's watchful eye. The doors had remained closed, the windows locked from within. There had been no commotion, no struggle, no opportunity. And yet, Pembroke was dead. Colonel Hastings, though not the Hastings one might expect, was the first to recover his voice. "There must be some explanation," he said, though it sounded less like certainty and more like a plea. A trick of some kind. Poison, perhaps? Dr. Renfield, seated 2 chairs down from the victim, shook his head after a cursory examination. "No, the wound is real. A blade, narrow and sharp, delivered with remarkable accuracy." He hesitated, glancing around the table, but I saw no such blade. None of us did. A murmur rippled through the group, soft and uneasy. Each person replayed the last few minutes in their mind, searching for anything that might have gone unnoticed. A gesture too quick, a movement too subtle, but nothing came. At the far end of the table, a man who had thus far remained silent finally stirred. He was small, impeccably dressed, his mustache as precise as the symmetry of the room itself. His eyes, however, were alive with something sharper than fear, something closer to interest. Hercule Poirot set down his spoon with deliberate care. "Mes amis," he said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade far cleaner than the one that had struck Pembroke. "We are in the presence of a most curious problem." Lady Margaret turned to him, her composure cracking just enough to reveal desperation. "Monsieur Poirot, you must help us." This cannot be explained." Poirot rose, smoothing his jacket as though preparing for a social call rather than a murder investigation. His gaze moved from one face to another, lingering just long enough to unsettle. "On the contrary, madam, it must be explained. Everything that occurs in this world obeys a certain logic, even murder." He stepped closer to the body, examining it not with haste, but with a kind of reverence, as though it were a puzzle laid out for his inspection. His eyes flicked to the wineglass, the arrangement of cutlery, the untouched dessert. Then, slowly, he turned back to the table. "You say that no one left their seat," he continued. "That no weapon was seen. That the doors and windows remained secured." He clasped his hands behind his back. "Très bien. Then we must accept these facts not as obstacles, but as truths." A pause followed, heavy with expectation. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And if they are truths," he said, "then we are left with only one conclusion." He looked at each of them in turn, his voice dropping just enough to make them lean in, whether they wished to or not. "Everyone at this table is lying." A silence followed his words, but it was no ordinary silence. It was the kind that pressed against the ears, thick with unspoken thoughts and carefully guarded truths. No one protested. No one laughed off the absurdity of the claim. Instead, they shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, as though each had been touched by the same invisible accusation. Poirot seemed to take note of this without appearing to do so. "Let us proceed with order," he said, as though restoring civility to a disrupted dinner rather than dissecting a murder. "We must not allow the imagination to run ahead of the facts. That is a most dangerous habit." From somewhere beyond the closed doors, hurried footsteps approached, followed by the firm knock of authority. Inspector Japp entered soon after, a broad-shouldered man with a face that suggested long familiarity with human folly and little patience for its subtler varieties. His eyes swept the room, taking in the body, the guests, the tension. "Well," he muttered, stepping forward, "this is a fine mess." Inspector Japp moved directly to the body, kneeling with practiced efficiency. "No one leaves the room," he added, almost as an afterthought. "Standard procedure." Poirot inclined his head politely. "But of course, mon ami, procedure is essential." Japp gave him a brief lacone that carried both recognition and mild irritation before returning his attention to the victim. "What have we got?" "A single wound," Dr. Renfield replied. "Clean, precise, fatal within seconds." "No weapon?" Japp asked. "None," said Lady Margaret, her voice steadier now, though her fingers still twisted the handkerchief in her lap. "We have searched. There is nothing." Japp grunted. "There's always something." He rose and began his own inspection, circling the table, peering beneath chairs, checking the floor with methodical thoroughness. Meanwhile, Poirot remained still for a moment longer, his gaze drifting not to the obvious, but to the overlooked. It settled first on the table setting before the deceased. Everything was immaculate, almost too immaculate. The knife lay perfectly aligned beside the plate, untouched. The fork, too. The dessert spoon rested where it had been placed, its polished surface reflecting the trembling candlelight, untouched. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned closer, not to the wound, but to the glass in Pembroke's hand. It was empty, though a faint residue clung to the inner surface, barely visible unless one knew to look. He lifted it gently, turning it toward the light, then set it back exactly as he had found it. "Inspector," he said quietly, "you observed the glass." Japp glanced over. "What about it?" "Man was drinking. Nothing unusual there." "Perhaps," Poirot murmured. "And yet, it is often in the ordinary that we find the extraordinary." He moved on. His attention shifted next to the guests, one by one. Colonel Hastings avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the far wall. Dr. Renfield stood rigid, his earlier confidence replaced by something tighter, more controlled. A young woman at the far end, Miss Evelyn Carter, sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed to the point of artifice. And then there was Lady Margaret. She met Poirot's eyes directly, almost defiantly. But it was not defiance he saw, it was calculation, the kind that comes not from innocence, but from careful preparation. Poirot gave the faintest of smiles. "Tell me, madam," he said, his tone light, conversational, "you poured the wine yourself this evening, did you not?" A flicker so quick it might have been imagined passed across her face. "Yes," she replied. "I always do. It is a habit." "Ah, habit," Poirot repeated softly. "And habits, they are the most revealing things of all." Japp, meanwhile, had reached the far end of the room. "Windows are locked," he announced. "No sign of forced entry. Doors were shut, you say?" "They never opened," Colonel Hastings said quickly. "Not once." "Servants?" Japp asked. "Only to bring dessert," Lady Margaret answered. They left immediately. Japp frowned. "So we've got a man stabbed at a table, surrounded by witnesses, and no one saw a thing." He shook his head. "Doesn't add up." "No," Poirot agreed, his voice almost absent. "It does not add up. It subtracts." Japp shot him a look. "Meaning?" Poirot turned back to the table, his gaze once again settling on the untouched dessert, the empty glass, the perfectly aligned cutlery. "Something is missing," he said. The room seemed to tighten around those words. "Not an object," Poirot continued, almost to himself. "No, that would be too simple. It is a momentous, small, insignificant moment that has been removed from the truth. And without it," he glanced up, his eyes gleaming faintly, "everything becomes impossible." He straightened, smoothing his sleeves. "And yet," he added quietly, "impossible things, they do not happen. Only things that are misunderstood." His gaze returned once more to Lady Margaret. "And misunderstandings," Poirot said, "they are so often deliberate. The tension in the room did not break, it shifted, like a chessboard subtly rearranged, while no one admitted to moving a piece." Inspector Japp cleared his throat, drawing attention back to something solid, something procedural. "Right," he said, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "Well, take statements. One at a time. Keep it simple. Keep it clear." "Clarity," murmured Hercule Poirot softly, "is so often the enemy of truth when it is forced." Japp ignored that and turned first to Colonel Hastings. Start from the moment dessert was served." Hastings shifted in his chair, running a hand over his collar as though it had suddenly grown tight. "There's not much to say." We were all seated. The servants came in, placed the dishes, and left. No one spoke for a moment, I remember that. "It was quiet, Japp repeated. "Yes, unusually so." Then Pembroke raised his glass. "He said something about good company, I think. And then he swallowed. Then he stopped. Just like that. You didn't see anyone move?" Japp pressed. "No, no one moved." Poirot tilted his head slightly but said nothing. Japp turned next to Dr. Renfield. "You were closest. What did you observe?" Renfield adjusted his cuffs, his voice measured. "Very little beyond what has been said. Mr. Pembroke appeared perfectly well one moment, then not. I noticed his expression change very slightly, a tightening around the eyes. It suggested pain but not shock. That is why I initially considered poison." "But you've ruled that out," Japp said. "Yes. The wound is undeniable, and yet you didn't see how it was delivered." "No," Renfield replied, a fraction too quickly. "I did not." Poirot's gaze lingered on him a second longer than necessary. "Curious," Poirot murmured. "A man trained to observe the smallest changes in the human body, and yet the most decisive action escapes him entirely." Renfield stiffened but did not respond. Japp moved on. "Miss Carter." The young woman lifted her eyes, calm, almost rehearsed. "There is nothing I can add. I was watching Lady Margaret pour the wine. It is a charming ritual of hers. I remember thinking how steady her hand was. All eyes shifted, almost involuntarily, toward Lady Margaret. She did not flinch. And after that?" Japp asked. "I looked back at my plate," Miss Carter continued. "When I looked up again, it had already happened. No sound." Japp pressed. "A glass, perhaps," she said after a pause. "Or maybe I imagined it." "A convenient imagination," Poirot said gently. Miss Carter met his gaze without blinking. "Or an honest one." Japp scribbled something down before turning to Lady Margaret herself. "Your turn, madam." She folded her hands neatly on the table, her composure now almost absolute. "There is very little to tell. I poured the wine, as I always do. I sat. My husband made his toast. And then—" her voice softened, but did not break. "He died." "You didn't notice anything unusual?" Japp asked. "No," she said firmly. "Nothing at all." Poirot stepped forward then, his movement quiet but deliberate. "Not even a small irregularity? A hesitation, perhaps? A moment where something felt out of place?" Her eyes flickered, just once. "No, Monsieur Poirot." "Ah," he said softly. "That is most interesting." Japp frowned. "What is?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, addressing the table as a whole. "You see, each of you has given us a piece of the same moment. A moment so brief, so insignificant, that it should align perfectly from every perspective." He clasped his hands behind his back. "And yet it does not." He looked toward Hastings. "You recall silence. To Renfield. You recall a change in expression. To Miss Carter. You recall a steady hand pouring wine. Finally, to Lady Margaret. And you, madame, you recall nothing at all." A pause, which is perhaps the most revealing detail of all. Japp exhaled sharply. "People forget things. Doesn't make them killers." "None," Poirot agreed. "But selective memory, Inspector, it is a different matter entirely." He began to pace slowly along the table, his eyes distant now, assembling fragments. "One of you notices too much, one of you notices too little, and one of you—" He stopped, glancing briefly at Renfield. "Notices exactly what is necessary, and nothing more." Renfield's jaw tightened. Poirot smiled faintly, almost kindly. "You are all cooperating. That is clear. But cooperation, mes amis, it can be the most elegant form of concealment." The room seemed colder now, the candlelight harsher. "And beneath your words," Poirot continued, his voice dropping just enough to draw them in, "I begin to hear something else." He tapped the table lightly with one finger. "Not truth," he said, "a beat, but motive." The word seemed to linger in the air, motive like a scent no one could quite place but all instinctively recognized. It shifted the room again, not outwardly, but inwardly. Eyes no longer searched for what had happened, but why. Inspector Japp closed his notebook with a soft snap. "Right then," he said, glancing around the table. "Let's talk about reasons. Because a man doesn't end up dead like this without someone wanting him that way." "Ah," said Hercule Poirot quietly. "But sometimes, Inspector, it is not one person who wants it." Japp frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Poirot did not answer directly. Instead, he turned toward Colonel Hastings. "You have known Mr. Pembroke for some time, I believe?" Hastings hesitated, then nodded. "Business acquaintances, investments. We had disagreements." "Financial?" Poirot asked. "Yes," Hastings admitted. "Pembroke was ruthless. He forced me into a position last year, nearly ruined me. I recovered, but only just." "And tonight?" Poirot asked gently. "Were matters resolved?" Hastings gave a short, humorless laugh. "He invited me here to celebrate a partnership. Can you imagine? After everything." "Ah," Poirot murmured, "a reconciliation, or a final humiliation." Hastings said nothing. Poirot turned next to Miss Carter. "And you, mademoiselle? Your connection?" She met his gaze steadily. "My father worked for Mr. Pembroke. He died 5 years ago." "A tragedy," Poirot said softly. "A convenient one," she replied. "At least for Mr. Pembroke. There were allegations, misconduct. My father was blamed, dismissed, disgraced." Her voice remained calm, but something colder moved beneath it. "He took his own life shortly after." A silence followed. "And you believe," Poirot said carefully, "that this blame was unjust?" "I know it was," she said. "Yet you accepted an invitation to dine with the man responsible?" Her lips curved slightly. "People do curious things, Monsieur Poirot." "Indeed," he said, "especially when they are patient." Japp shifted, clearly dissatisfied with the direction. "Revenge, money fine. That gives us half a dozen motives already. Doesn't tell us how it was done." "None," Poirot agreed. "But it tells us why each of you might wish it to be done." His attention moved again, settling now on Dr. Renfield. "And you, Doctor," he said. "Your relationship with the deceased?" Renfield exhaled slowly. "Professional. I attended him occasionally. He was not a well man." "Ah," Poirot said, his eyes sharpening slightly. "No." "A heart condition," Renfield continued. "Nothing immediate, but serious enough." "And yet," Poirot said, gesturing lightly toward the body, "he does not die of the heart." Renfield's expression tightened. "No. Was there disagreement between you?" A pause. "Yes," Renfield said at last. "He refused certain treatments, accused me of exaggerating his condition, threatened to replace me, which would have been inconvenient. It would have been professional loss," Renfield said curtly. "Of course," Poirot replied, though his tone suggested something less innocent. Finally, his gaze returned to Lady Margaret. "And you, madam," he said softly, "the closest relationship of all." She did not look away. "My husband was not an easy man." "No," Poirot said gently, "that much is clear." "He controlled everything," she continued. "The house, the finances, even the people we associated with. This dinner," she gestured faintly. "It was his idea, his design." "A stage," Poirot murmured. "If you like," she said. "And you played your part." Her eyes flickered again. "I always did." Poirot studied her for a long moment, then stepped back, his hands once more clasped behind him. "So," he said quietly, almost to himself, "we have before us a most elegant arrangement. A man surrounded by those he has wronged financially, professionally, personally, each with reason, each with opportunity. In theory, Japp snorted. Opportunity's the problem. No one moved. Ah, Poirot said, turning slightly. But perhaps we are asking the wrong question. Japp crossed his arms. And what's the right one? Poirot's gaze drifted back to the table of untouched dessert, the empty glass, the perfect alignment of objects that now felt anything but natural. Not who had the opportunity, he said slowly. A pause. But who created it? The words settled heavily. Poirot's eyes moved once more across the faces before him, lingering just a fraction longer on each than comfort allowed. Because this, he continued softly, is not the work of impulse. It is design. Careful, deliberate, shared, perhaps in ways we do not yet see. Japp stared at him. You're suggesting more than one of them. Poirot gave the faintest shrug. I suggest only this, Inspector, when every path leads to a different motive, it is not because the truth is hidden. His gaze sharpened. It is because the truth is divided. The idea lingered unassailed, truth divide not dismissed, but not yet embraced. Inspector Japp, however, was not a man to let abstraction delay action. He moved again, this time with sharper purpose, his eyes scanning the room not for theory, but for something tangible, something he could hold up and call proof. It came, as such things often do, from the least expected place. One of the constables, who had been quietly examining the chairs along the far wall, straightened abruptly. "Sir," he said, holding something up between two fingers. "Found this under the table." Japp crossed the room in 2 strides. "Let's have a look." It was small, slender, almost delicate. A thin blade, no longer than a finger, its surface gleaming faintly in the candlelight. One end tapered to a wickedly fine point, the other bore a narrow ring, as though it had once been fitted into something concealed, perhaps, within an object not meant to draw attention. "Ah," Japp said, satisfaction breaking through at last. "Now that's more like it." A murmur passed through the room, sharper this time, edged with something closer to fear. Hercule Poirot stepped closer, his expression unchanged, though his eyes sharpened with interest. "Très intéressant," he murmured. Japp turned the blade over carefully. Slim enough to hide in a sleeve, or a ring mechanism, could be spring-loaded, quick thrust, quick release, weapon drops, slides under the table, no one the wiser. He looked up, scanning the guests. Clever, but not clever enough. "Inspector," Poirot said mildly, "you move very quickly." "Because I've got something real," Japp replied. "Not theories. Evidence." He turned sharply toward Dr. Renfield. "You said the wound was narrow, precise. This match." Renfield hesitated just a fraction. "Yes," he said. "It could or does." "It is consistent," Renfield said more firmly. Japp nodded, satisfied. Then his gaze shifted, narrowing slightly, as if something had just clicked into place. "And you," he said, pointing toward Miss Carter. "You were sitting closest to where this was found." All eyes turned. Miss Carter did not move immediately. Then, slowly, she unfolded her hands. "Proximity is not guilt, Inspector." "No," Japp said, "but it's a start." "She has motive," he continued, ticking it off with his fingers. "Revenge. She has opportunity close enough to strike without being noticed. And now," he lifted the blade slightly, "we have the weapon right under her seat." The room seemed to tighten around her. Lady Margaret's eyes flickered not with shock, but with something more measured. Colonel Hastings exhaled quietly, as though a tension he had not admitted was beginning to ease. Renfield said nothing at all. Miss Carter, however, remained composed. "If you believe I killed him," she said calmly, "then you must also believe I did so without moving, without being seen, and without leaving any trace until now." Japp shrugged. "People miss things. Happens all the time." "Not all people," she replied softly, her gaze drifting just briefly toward Poirot. Japp followed that look, irritation creeping back into his expression. "What do you think?" Poirot had not touched the blade. He stood slightly apart, observing not the object, but the reactions it had produced, the subtle shifts, the almost imperceptible relaxations. The way suspicion once diffused had now found a convenient center. "A most elegant solution," he said at last. Japp smirked. "Glad you agree." "But," Poirot added gently. The word hung there. Japp's smirk faded. "But what?" Poirot stepped forward now, his gaze finally dropping to the blade. He bent slightly, examining it without contact, his eyes tracing its shape, its balance, the faint glimmer along its edge. "It arrives," he said softly, at precisely the right moment. Japp frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Poirot straightened, his expression thoughtful. "When confusion is at its peak, when suspicion threatens to scatter in all directions, suddenly we are given clarity, a weapon, a position, a suspect." He looked toward Miss Carter, then beyond her to the others. "It is convenient." Japp's voice hardened. "You think it was planted?" "I think," Poirot said carefully, "that it resolves too much too quickly. That's called solving the case," Japp snapped. "Is it?" Poirot asked softly. Silence followed. Miss Carter watched him now with quiet intensity. Lady Margaret remained still, her composure intact, though her fingers had stilled completely. Hastings looked uncertain, his earlier relief beginning to falter. Renfield's gaze had dropped to the table, to nothing. Poirot's eyes moved across them all. "You see," he continued almost gently, "a true solution does not simplify, it explains. And this," he gestured lightly toward the blade, "it explains only one thing, while leaving all others untouched." Japp crossed his arms. "It explains who killed him." "None," Poirot said, his voice suddenly very quiet. "It explains who you would like to believe killed him." The distinction settled heavily. "And that," Poirot added, his gaze sharpening just slightly, "is a very different matter." The blade gleamed faintly in Japp's hand, no longer a triumph, but something else entirely, something placed, perhaps, not to reveal the truth, but to hide it. The blade remained in Inspector Japp's hand, but its certainty had begun to dissolve, its clean narrative fraying under the weight of Poirot's quiet doubt. No one spoke for several seconds. The room, once eager for an answer, now seemed reluctant to accept one too easily. Poirot turned away from the weapon as though it no longer interested him. Instead, he returned to the table, to the arrangement of places, of people-off relationships. "Let us leave this for a moment," said Hercule Poirot softly. "There is something here, something older. It calls for attention." Japp exhaled sharply. "Older? We've got a fresh corpse, Poirot." "Oui," Poirot replied. "But the cause of death, Inspectorate, may not be fresh at all." His gaze settled once more on Miss Carter. "Your father," he said gently. "You told us he was accused of misconduct." "Dismissed, disgraced." "Yes," she said. "And the responsibility was placed upon him alone?" "That is what Mr. Pembroke ensured." Poirot nodded slowly, then turned to Colonel Hastings. "You—" Moncaloniu spoke of financial ruin. "Forced into a position, yes." Hastings shifted uneasily. "Yes, by Mr. Pembroke alone." There was a hesitation this time longer, heavier. "No," Hastings admitted. "There were others involved. A consortium of sorts. Pembroke was the face of it, but not the only one." Poirot's eyes flickered. "And Dr. Renfield," he continued, turning smoothly, "you say you attended Mr. Pembroke professionally." "For how long?" "Several years," Renfield replied. "And before that?" Renfield hesitated. "I consulted for various firms, corporate health matters, insurance evaluations." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Including, perhaps, the firm where Miss Carter's father was employed." The room stilled. Renfield's face tightened. "I don't recall every client." "But you recall this one," Poirot said softly. A pause. "Yes," Renfield said at last. "I do." Miss Carter's eyes snapped toward him, something sharper than composure breaking through for the first time. "You testified," she said quietly, "at the inquiry." Renfield did not meet her gaze. "I gave a medical assessment." "You declared him unstable," she continued, her voice tightening. "Unfit. That his judgment was compromised." Renfield remained silent. Poirot's voice slipped in, almost gently. "And such a declaration, it would be. Decisive, n'est-ce pas? It would shift the blame very conveniently." Hastings looked between them now, unease growing. "Wait, are you saying this is all connected?" Poirot turned slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I am saying, mon ami, that what appears to be a collection of separate grievances begins to resemble a pattern." He gestured lightly toward the table. "A man ruined financially," he said, nodding to Hastings. "A man disgraced and driven to death." A glance to Miss Carter, a doctor whose professional standing depends upon certain alignments. His eyes rested briefly on Renfield. "And at the center of it all, Mr. Pembroke." Japp frowned. "That still doesn't explain tonight." "None," Poirot agreed. "But it explains something far more important." "And what's that?" Japp asked. Poirot's gaze hardened just slightly. "Why none of this began tonight." The words settled heavily. Miss Carter leaned forward now, her composure no longer perfect. "If you're suggesting this was planned, I suggest nothing yet," Poirot interrupted gently. "I observe." He began to move again, slowly, deliberately, circling the table as though tracing an invisible thread that bound them all together. "You see," he continued, "when a crime is committed, we ask who benefits. But when a crime is shared, then we must ask something else." He stopped, his eyes moving from one face to another. "Who remembers?" A silence followed. Hastings looked troubled now. "I didn't know about her father," he said, glancing toward Miss Carter. "I swear it." "I believe you," Poirot said calmly. "But you knew enough of Pembroke's methods to accept his invitation tonight." Hastings said nothing. Poirot turned back toward the center of the table, his gaze drifting once more to the empty glass, the untouched dessert, the perfect stillness that had concealed so much. "This dinner," he said softly, "it was not merely a gathering. It was a convergence." Japp crossed his arms again. "You're saying they all had reason to hate him?" "We already knew that." Poirot shook his head slightly. "Not hate, Inspector. Something far more dangerous." Japp frowned. "What's that?" Poirot's eyes lifted, his voice quiet but precise. "History." The words seemed to echo. "And history," he added, "it has a way of returning, not as memory, but as design." His gaze moved once more across the table, lingering now not on suspicion but on connection. "And when it does," Poirot said softly, "it rarely belongs to one person alone." The word lingered history, and with it came a weight that no one at the table could comfortably deny. It was no longer a question of a single act committed in a fleeting moment, but of something constructed, layered, and perhaps shared. Yet Poirot did not press further. Instead, he did something altogether unexpected. He returned to his seat. Inspector Japp blinked. "What are you doing?" "Continuing the dinner," said Hercule Poirot calmly, as he adjusted his napkin with meticulous care. "It would be most regrettable to allow such excellent arrangements to go entirely to waste." Japp stared at him. "There's been a murder." "Precisely," Poirot replied. "And therefore we must proceed with even greater attention to detail." Without waiting for approval, he gestured lightly toward the untouched desserts. "I would ask that each of you resume your places, exactly as before." No one moved at first. Then, slowly, reluctantly, they obeyed. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Hands returned to the table. The arrangement reformed itself almost perfectly, like a scene being reset for a second performance. Only one place remained occupied by absence Pembroke's. Poirot's eyes flicked to it briefly, then away. "Très bien," he said. "Now, we repeat." Japp exhaled sharply. "Repeat what?" "The moment," Poirot said. "The final minutes before our unfortunate host met his end." "This is ridiculous," Japp muttered, but he did not stop it. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Lady Margaret, you will pour the wine once more." Her fingers hesitated just once before she reached for the bottle. "There is no wine left in his glass," she said. "Then we shall imagine it," Poirot replied gently. "What matters is not the liquid, but the action." She rose slightly. Just as before, her movements graceful, controlled. She mimed the act of pouring, her hand steady, precise. "Excellent," Poirot murmured. "Now, you will all follow your memory. Not your words, your memory." Miss Carter's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table. Colonel Hastings glanced down at his plate. Dr. Renfield remained very still. Poirot's voice softened. "Mr. Pembroke raises his glass," he said quietly. gesturing toward the empty space. "He speaks. You listen. And then—" He paused. "And then something happens." The room held its breath. "Again," Poirot said. They repeated it. Lady Margaret poured. Hastings looked down. Miss Carter watched. Renfield sat motionless. And again Poirot insisted. This time something shifted. It was small, so small that Japp almost missed it. As Lady Margaret mimed the pouring, Miss Carter's gaze did not remain on her hand. It flickered quickly, instinct to Villeneuve, to the bottle, not to the glass, but to Dr. Renfield. Poirot saw it. Of course he did. "Encore," he said softly. A third time. Now the tension was sharper, less controlled. The repetition had begun to strip away performance, leaving behind something closer to instinct. Lady Margaret poured. Hastings adjusted his sleeve. Renfield's fingers twitched just against the table. And Miss Carter this time. She did not look at Renfield. She looked at the empty seat. At the exact moment Poirot had said something happens, her breath caught, barely audible, but enough. Poirot straightened slowly. "Merci," he said. Japp frowned. What was that supposed to prove? Poirot did not answer immediately. His gaze moved between Miss Carter and Dr. Renfield, not accusing, not confirming, simply observing. "Human memory," he said at last, "is a curious thing. When we lie, we construct. But when we remember—" He tapped his temple lightly. "We reveal." Japp crossed his arms. "I didn't see anything." "None," Poirot said. "Because you were looking for action." He turned slightly, his eyes settling on Renfield. "But I," he continued softly, "was looking for reaction." Renfield's jaw tightened. "This proves nothing." "On the contrary," Poirot said gently, "it proves that at the moment of death, your attention was not where you claim it to be." Renfield's voice hardened. "I already told you I saw very little." "Yes," Poirot said, "and yet your body remembers more than your words." A pause. Miss Carter's gaze remained fixed on the table now, her earlier composure fractured just enough to matter. Poirot's voice dropped, quieter still. "And you, mademoiselle?" he said, without looking at her directly. "You do not watch the hand that pours. You watch the man who prepares." The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was precise, because something had just been revealed, not a confession, not yet but a fracture, and through it the truth had begun to breathe. The silence that followed Poirot's words was no longer uncertain, it was strained, as though something invisible had begun to pull too tightly beneath the surface. No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt the delicate balance that had just shifted. Inspector Japp, however, was not a man to indulge in invisible tensions for long. He turned sharply, lifting the slender blade again. "Right," he said. "We've got enough to move forward. This," he gestured with it, "goes into evidence. And we'll see how long these reactions hold up under proper questioning." He stepped toward the sideboard, where a small leather case had been placed for collected items. The constable moved to assist, opening it carefully. For a brief moment, all attention shifted there. It was enough. A sound, soft, almost indistinguishable, came from the table behind them. Not a crash, not a movement, just the faintest disturbance, like fabric brushing against polished wood. Poirot's head turned instantly. "Inspector," said Hercule Poirot quietly. Japp looked back. The blade was gone. For a second, no one reacted, not because they had not seen, but because the mind refused to accept it so quickly. The case lay open, empty. The constable stared down at it, confused. "Too just," he stammered. Japp's voice cut through sharply. "What do you mean, just?" "Where is it?" "I put nothing in yet, sir." "You still had it." Japp looked at his hand. Empty. The shift in the room was immediate and electric. Chairs scraped. Eyes widened. Every person present seemed suddenly aware of every other person not as companions, but as threats. "That's not possible," Japp snapped. No one moved. Poirot did not raise his voice. "On the contrary, Inspector," he said softly. "Someone did." Japp turned in a slow circle, his gaze hardening. "No one leaves this room," he said again, more forcefully now. "No one touches anything. Do you hear me?" But the damage was done. Trust-already Fraggle had shattered completely. Colonel Hastings stood halfway from his chair, his face pale. "This is madness," he muttered. "We're being toyed with." Miss Carter said nothing, but her eyes moved quickly now, sharper, more alert than before. Dr. Renfield had gone very still, again too still. And Lady Margaret, she remained seated, composed, watching. Poirot's gaze drifted slowly across them, measuring not their words, but their stillness. The kind of stillness that comes not from innocence, but from control. "Fascinating," he murmured. Japp shot him an irritated look. "Fascinating. We've just lost the one solid piece of evidence we had." Poirot agreed, "and that is precisely why it is fascinating." He began to walk, slowly, retracing the space between the table and the sideboard. "You see, Inspector, when evidence disappears, it tells us something very important." Japp crossed his arms. "Yeah, that someone's guilty." Poirot shook his head slightly. "No, that someone is afraid." He stopped near the chair where Dr. Renfield had been sitting. "Afraid," he continued softly, "not of being accused, but of being understood." Renfield's voice came tight. "This proves nothing. Anyone could have taken it." "None," Poirot said gently. "Not anyone." He turned slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "The timing is too perfect, the opportunity too precise. This is not panacit, is intervention." Japp frowned. "Intervention, yes," Poirot said. "A correction, the removal of a narrative that was becoming inconvenient." Miss Carter's voice broke in quietly. "You mean the blade wasn't the truth?" Poirot looked at her. "I mean, mademoiselle, that it was never meant to survive scrutiny." A pause. "Then why bring it out at all?" Hastings asked, his voice strained. Poirot's expression softened, just slightly. "To guide us," he said. "Toward what?" Japp demanded. Poirot's gaze moved once more across the table, slower now, more deliberate. "A conclusion," he said quietly. "One that arrives too easily, and therefore too soon." The room felt smaller now, the walls closer. Because if the evidence could vanish, then so could certainty. Japp ran a hand through his hair, frustration rising. "So what now? We've got nothing again." Poirot smiled faintly. "On the contrary, Inspector," he said. "Now, we have something far more valuable." Japp glared. "Which is?" Poirot's eyes sharpened, his voice dropping just enough to pull every ear toward him. "Someone among us," he said, "who is no longer content to wait." The implication settled like a shadow over the room. Because the game had changed, and whoever had just removed the blade had revealed not caution but urgency. The room had barely begun to absorb the tension from the missing blade when a sudden noise shattered the uneasy quieta crash from the far side of the dining room. Chairs scraped violently as everyone turned, hearts quickening, and for a heartbeat, the careful composure of the evening dissolved completely. A scream followed, high and panicked, originating from the hallway outside. Poirot's eyes flicked toward the source, calm but alert, as if he had expected precisely this disruption. "Inspector," he said softly, "it seems the game is not yet finished." Japp had already drawn himself upright. "What now?" he barked, moving toward the doorway, but Poirot was ahead, stepping with fluid precision, his gaze sweeping over the guests with surgical attention. Each one had shifted some subtly, some blatantly, but Poirot noted the micro-expressions of fear, curiosity, and calculation. They reached the hallway, and the scene revealed itself. The butler, a tall, nervous man, lay sprawled across the floor, a faint pool of blood spreading beneath him. He groaned but was conscious, clutching his arm as though it had been struck. A heavy silver candlestick rested a few feet away, smeared with crimson. The attack had been quick, precise, leaving no one sure of the assailant. But everyone suddenly aware that the perpetrator was still in the house, still moving among them, still one step ahead. Poirot knelt beside the injured man. "You were attacked, yes?" he asked softly. The butler nodded, wincing. "Came out to check the wine cellar, sir." "Nothing." Then something struck me from behind. Poirot's eyes flicked over the hallway, noting the layout, the angles, the shadows cast by the flickering wall sconces. "And you saw nothing?" "Heard nothing. Nothing at all," the man whispered. "I didn't see anyone." Poirot straightened slowly, his gaze scanning the assembled guests who had followed behind them. "Ah," he murmured, the perfection of invisibility. He turned to Japp. "Inspector, we are not merely chasing a past crime. We are now observing the present danger." Japp ran a hand over his face, frustration and fear mixing visibly. "So the murderer is bold enough to strike again, and still clever enough to avoid detection." "We," Poirot agreed, "observe, my friend, that our friend one who removed the blade eye is escalating. The blade was a signal, the attack is confirmation. This is no longer a crime of opportunity. It is a performance." Miss Carter shivered subtly but kept her composure. Lady Margaret's expression remained calm, almost eerily so, though her fingers tightened slightly in her lap. Colonel Hastings looked increasingly uneasy, glancing at everyone around him as though the walls themselves had become suspect. Poirot's gaze fell back on the hallway floor. "And yet," he said softly, "there is always a trace, always a detail that escapes the perpetrator's notice." Japp's eyebrows shot up. "What do you mean?" Poirot leaned slightly, examining the candlestick. A faint fingerprint, smeared but still legible, ran along the polished surface. Not just smudged indentation, a subtle pressure, the weight of a particular hand. "See here," he said, tapping gently. "The one who struck is hurried, yes, but hurried with precision. The mark betrays a dominant hand, careful but not expert in concealment. An urgency, not panicked ignorance." The butler's groan cut across Poirot's observations. I didn't even hear them approach," he muttered. Poirot's eyes lifted. "Exactly. That is why the invisible act of the first crime of missing blade was a rehearsal, a test. Tonight it escalated. The individual is now probing for reaction, gauging the limits of our attention." Japp stepped back, running a hand over his hair. "So we're dealing with someone who's orchestrating the whole evening, and we're just pieces in their game." "Precisely, Inspector," Poirot said, his voice low, controlled, almost soothing. "And the danger now is immediate. Not only must we solve a past murder, we must prevent another. Observe carefully, listen to every hesitation, note every glance, and consider each motive anew. The culprit is closer than we think." A sudden creak from the staircase drew everyone's gaze upward. Poirot's eyes flicked there for a heartbeat before settling back on the group. "And perhaps," he murmured quietly, "much closer than we dare to imagine." The room held its breath. The first murder had been a puzzle. The missing blade had been a diversion. Now, the attack in the hallway proved the game had changed entirely. Whoever had planned it, whoever had struck the butler, had shown clearly. The true danger was not over, and the house itself had become the stage for a second, far more dangerous act. And Poirot, as always, was watching every shadow, every subtle twitch, every concealed intention, knowing that the next revelation would arrive not from chance, but from the careful manipulation of those who thought themselves invisible. The chaos lingered, like smoke that refuses to disperse. The butler groaned softly from the floor, the guests still clustered in the hallway, and Inspector Japp's frustration simmered beneath his attempt at authority. Poirot, however, remained calm, almost serenely so, as if the storm around him were no more than a breeze against his meticulous mind. He let the moments pass, observing every glance, every shift in posture, every flicker of hesitation. And then something small caught his attention. It was a faint, almost imperceptible habit. Lady Margaret, seated again at the dining table under his subtle direction, had been arranging the silverware repeatedly, minutely adjusting the placement of forks and knives after each interruption. At first, Poirot had dismissed it as nervousness, a perfunctory attempt at composure. But now, in the aftermath of the second attack, it seemed different, deliberate, calculated, a signal disguised as habit. Poirot leaned slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward Hastings. "Observe, mon ami, how the hand moves not merely in alignment with table manners, but in rhythm with opportunity. Each shift, each adjustment, occurs precisely when attention is diverted elsewhere." Hastings squinted, uncertain. "You mean she's giving signals?" "Perhaps," Poirot murmured. "Or perhaps she is masking them but unconsciously revealing them. One cannot always hide the truth while appearing to perform a task as banal as straightening silverware." He let his eyes drift around the table, noting the other small details. Miss Carter's gaze, which lingered too long on the empty seat once occupied by Pembroke Renfield's hand, which twitched at a specific interval every time conversation turned toward financial affairs, Hastings' subtle foot movements, a nervous beat under the table when questions became pointed. None of these had seemed important alone, but now, in the context of the missing blade, the attack on the butler, and the controlled chaos of the evening, they coalesced into a rhythm pattern. Poirot straightened fully. "Mon Dieu," he whispered under his breath. "It has been before us all along." Japp frowned. "What has?" "The order of attention," Poirot said softly, pointing to the dining table. "The pattern of observation and distraction. The moments when the murderer moves, acts, or misdirects are timed with the reactions of those around Heimacher. A cadence. And like all cadences, it has a flaw." Hastings leaned forward, eager but uncertain. "A flaw? You mean we can catch them?" "Yes," Poirot said, his eyes flicking toward Miss Carter. "The small detailed hand that moves, the eyes that linger, the slight hesitation these betray the orchestrator. One cannot perfectly synchronize every action with deception. Even the most meticulous becomes predictable." Poirot paused, letting the weight of the realization settle in. The room was tense, every gaze now slightly wary, uncertain who might be watching, who might be waiting. "Consider the first act," he continued. "The missing blade. It seemed to implicate her, did it not? Convenient, precise, perfect in timing. Yet it was only the first movement in a sequence. The second act the attack revealed urgency, care, and risk. And now, observing the minutiae habitual gestures, the involuntary signals, we see the connecting thread." He turned to Japp, who was still frowning. "You see, Inspector, the case was never about a single motive, a single weapon, or even a single act. It was about rhythm, opportunity synchronized with observation, past grievances threaded into present actions. The villain's signature has been here all along, hidden within the smallest, most seemingly insignificant actions." A quiet shiver ran through the room. Even Lady Margaret's composure seemed slightly altered under the weight of Poirot's gaze. Every subtle twitch, every repeated motion seemingly mundane had been deliberate. The pattern was there, waiting for an observant eye. "And now," Poirot said softly, almost to himself, "the next move will come. Predictable, if one knows where to look." For the first time that evening, a sense of clarity began to settle. Amid chaos, stolen evidence, and misdirection, the invisible design had revealed itself. The key had indeed been in plain sight all along an elegant, dangerous sequence of habits, reactions, and subtle signals that only a mind trained to notice the imperceptible could read. Poirot's lips curved slightly. "Ah, and with this understanding we are finally prepared for what comes next." Poirot's eyes swept slowly over the gathered guests, lingering just a fraction longer on each than politeness would allow. The pattern was clear now. The invisible rhythm of gestures, glances, and hesitations had been mapped in his mind. What remained was the human element, the heart, the psychology, the motive that had driven someone to orchestrate such a meticulous chain of events. He turned first to Miss Carter. Her composure had returned in part, but her hands betrayed slight tremors, the faintest hint of tension at the table's edge. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "we have traced the movements, observed the deviations, and noted every subtle signal. But tell me, why does one risk everything for Mr. Pembroke's death?" Her gaze did not waver, but it hardened, a shield carefully placed. "You assume it is me," she said quietly. "Not yet," Poirot replied, voice soft but insistent. "I am merely asking for truth. The truth, unlike a lie, has no hesitation. The truth resides in action, not only in words." A slow exhalation passed from Hastings, who shifted uneasily in his chair. Lady Margaret's eyes were fixed ahead, serene, almost too composed, yet faint lines of concern traced at the corners of her eyes. Dr. Renfield remained still, his face a mask, but the set of his shoulders betrayed something more, a carefully maintained tension. Poirot walked deliberately to the fireplace, where the dying embers cast long shadows that danced across the room. "Each of you," he said softly, "has had reason to resent Mr. Pembroke. Financial ruin, professional disgrace, personal suffering, all of these form a web of motives. But the true thread's one that ties together the careful planning, the removal of evidence, the attack on the butleress more subtle, more intimate. He returned to the center of the room, gaze fixing now on Lady Margaret. "Madame, you have preserved composure admirably. Yet in your calm lies something darker. The careful positioning, the timing of responses, the subtle signals, these are not merely defensive acts. They are preparatory. And why prepare so meticulously if the purpose is simple revenge or greed?" Her lips pressed together, a fleeting shadow crossing her features. "I do not understand," she said softly, but Poirot saw the quick flash of recognition, as though she had heard herself exposed before words could betray her. Poirot's voice lowered, gentle yet piercing. "This is not about money, not merely power, not even vengeance for slights past. It is about control. The desire to dictate, to orchestrate, to manipulate not only events, but the very perception of those who stand around you. Every subtle act, the stolen blade, the orchestrated attack, the invisible signal has been intended to assert dominance over the minds of others, to demonstrate that the observer is never the one in command." Japp's mouth opened, then closed, uncertain. "You're saying she killed him just to prove she could?" Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Oui, Inspector. There is something far more dangerous than revenge. It is the need to show one's mastery over the chaos of human behavior. The risk of discovery, the precision required, the layering of actions over time, all these point not to impulse, but to calculated assertion." Miss Carter's eyes widened slightly, a shadow of alarm flashing. "That is preposterous," she said. Poirot did not flinch. "Is it? Observe the history, the connections, the previous grievances. All of you had reason to act, yet only she, his gaze sharpened, could manipulate events with such subtlety. Her attacks are not only physical, they are psychological. She has orchestrated the sequence to test your reactions, to measure your understanding, to ensure that she remains several steps ahead until the final moment." The room was still, the air thick with the weight of revelation. Hastings swallowed audibly. Lady Margaret's calm had cracked, a thin tremor betraying the recognition of her exposure. Dr. Renfield's hands flexed, fingers tightening against his knees. Poirot stepped closer, voice softening, almost empathetic. "Mademoiselle, the murder of Mr. Pembroke was not simply to end a life. It was to assert supremacy over memory, over perception, over the invisible dance of cause and effect. It is not passion or greed, it is a profound need to dominate, to control, to choreograph the very understanding of those who witness it." Miss Carter's lips parted, and for a heartbeat, her mask of calm faltered entirely. The subtle, meticulous predator, one who had hidden behind social grace and careful gesturesse, was finally exposed. Poirot's eyes lingered, unwavering, as the room absorbed the revelation. The crime had been committed not out of anger, not out of money, not out of revenge, but out of a deeper, darker psychology, the desire to prove absolute mastery over the lives and minds of everyone at the table. And now, at last, the hidden motive stood fully revealed, sharp and undeniable, as the heart of the evening's terrible and elegant design. Poirot's gaze swept over the room, now taut with anticipation. Every movement, every flicker of expression had been catalogued in his mind, every subtle signal noted and mapped. The pattern was complete, the motive revealed, and the invisible architecture of the crime fully understood. All that remained was the final act, the confrontation that would bring the truth into the harsh light of day. He stood slowly, hands folded calmly behind his back, and allowed his eyes to settle on Miss Carter. Her composure had returned, but it was a careful mask over a flicker of unease, almost imperceptible to anyone less trained than him. Hastings shifted nervously, glancing between the detective and the suspected murderer. Lady Margaret remained still, almost statuesque, though her breathing was slightly quicker, betraying the tension beneath her poised exterior. Dr. Renfield, for his part, seemed withdrawn, his attention split between the walls and his own hands. "Mon Dieu," Poirot began, his voice quiet but precise. "We have observed the entire sequence. The past and the present converge here tonight. The blade, the attack, the signals, the gesturesse were all part of your design." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle like a fine mist across the room. "And now, the moment has arrived to speak of truth, openly." Miss Carter's eyes flicked to Hastings, to Lady Margaret, to Dr. Renfield, before finally settling on Poirot. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "And what truth is that, Monsieur Poirot?" "The truth," he said, stepping closer with a controlled calm that seemed to fill the room, "is that you acted not out of passion, not out of revenge, not out of mere greed. You acted to prove mastery, to orchestrate and dominate the perceptions of those around you. Each act was calculated, each movement deliberate, each signal intended to mislead and to measure. You sought control over not only life, but understanding itself." A sudden flash passed across Miss Carter's face, a hesitation so brief that most would have missed it, but Poirot saw it. He allowed silence to stretch, letting the tension rise like a taut wire. "You think you are clever," Poirot continued, voice unhurried, "but even the most careful plan leaves a trace. The blade was never the key, it was a test. The attack on the butler was only a probe. The patterned, small, seemingly insignificant habitudes been under our observation all along. You cannot conceal instinct forever." Japp's voice broke the silence, sharp and impatient. "Well, then, what do we do? Arrest her now?" Poirot's eyes remained fixed on Miss Carter. "Not yet, Inspector. Observe." The predator instinct awakened. Miss Carter's composure faltered entirely this time. Her hand moved slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward her coat pocket. Poirot's eyes followed, unblinking. "Ah," he said softly, "and now the final move." Before anyone could react, she made a sudden dash for the door, a desperate bid for escape. Hastings lunged instinctively, but Poirot was quicker, stepping calmly yet decisively into her path, cutting off any chance of flight. His voice remained even, almost conversational. "You see, mademoiselle, one does not simply escape a conclusion when it is inevitable. There is nowhere left to hide." Miss Carter froze for the briefest heartbeat, realizing the futility of her gesture. Her eyes darted around, calculating, searching for another exit, another chance. Poirot's gaze did not waver. "It is over," he said quietly. "All the pieces are in place. Every act observed, every reaction noted. You are discovered." She sank into a chair, the tension leaving her body in a slow, reluctant exhalation. "So you know it was me," she whispered, a note of defiance mixing with relief that the chase was done. Poirot inclined his head, expression calm, almost gentle. "Oui, mademoiselle? You have revealed yourself not through words, but through action. And in this, the truth emerges more elegant than a confession, more revealing than accusation." Japp moved forward, restraining her carefully, while Hastings and Lady Margaret watched, the weight of understanding settling over them. Dr. Renfield exhaled quietly, his earlier tension fading, the danger contained. Poirot stepped back, folding his hands neatly before him. "And so," he said softly, "the evening's design is complete. The crime, the deception, the motiveel have been revealed. The pattern, the psychology, the hidden hanthy are no longer invisible." In the quiet that followed, the room seemed to breathe collectively, the tautness of fear and suspicion slowly easing. And through it all, Poirot remained at the center, serene and composed, the architect of understanding in a chaos built by another, having finally brought the truth into the light. The room had finally settled into a brittle calm. Miss Carter was now securely held by Inspector Japp, her defiance muted by the inevitability of capture. Hastings exhaled, rubbing his temples, as Lady Margaret sank slightly into her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Dr. Renfield's posture relaxed, though his eyes remained watchful, scanning every corner as if anticipating a hidden threat. Poirot, serene as ever, folded his hands before him and allowed the momentary stillness to fill the space. It seemed that the evening's terrible design had reached its conclusion. Yet Poirot's gaze lingered on the group with that quiet intensity that suggested nothing was truly concluded. His mind, always alert to the imperceptible, caught the subtlest of details, the slight sheen of perspiration along Lady Margaret's temple, the micro-shift in Renfield's fingers, the way Hastings' foot tapped an almost imperceptible rhythm against the floor. There was a ripple, a disturbance that did not belong to the chaos already accounted for. "Inspector," Poirot said softly, drawing Japp's attention, "do you notice anything unusual about our witnesses?" Japp glanced around, frowning. "They are quiet. They've done nothing since we arrested her." "We," Poirot replied. Yet sometimes silence is louder than confession. He allowed a long pause, his sharp eyes moving deliberately between Lady Margaret and Renfield. Observe attention to the details that remain even after the apparent conclusion is reached. Small inconsistencies, barely perceptible, but telling all the same. Renfield shifted slightly, and Poirot's gaze settled. "Ah," he murmured. "Yes, that is the final thread." Hastings frowned. "What are you talking about?" Miss Carter admitted it. "She orchestrated everything." Poirot inclined his head slowly. "She did not act alone." Japp's eyebrows shot up. "What do you mean? You mean there was another person involved?" "Mais oui," Poirot said softly. "The true brilliance of the design lies not in one mind, but in collaboration subtle, hidden, and nearly invisible." He moved closer to the table, hands clasped behind him. The first blade, the attack on the butler, the signals, the patinette all points to her actions. But the precision, the timing of interventions, the way certain acts were anticipated, suggests guidance from another mind. Lady Margaret's calm fractured subtly, a flicker across her face, almost imperceptible but enough. Poirot's eyes fixed upon her. "Madam," he said quietly, "you have observed closely tonight, have you not? Every hesitation, every distraction, every minor actor attention was never idle. And yet, you have remained too calm." She stiffened slightly. Poirot allowed a faint smile. "Ah, mais non, there is no need to speak. The truth is already visible. Your hand subtle, deliberate enabled certain actions to proceed without detection. You were the orchestrator behind the orchestrator. Miss Carter is the visible hand, but you were the hidden mind." Gasps rippled through the room. Hastings stared, slack-jawed. Japp's mouth fell open, as if the very air had been stolen from him. Even Renfield's composure wavered, a faint twitch betraying surprise. Lady Margaret's eyes darted to Miss Carter, then back to Poirot, realization dawning. You're saying... While Miss Carter performed the acts, you guided them, nudged them, ensured timing, controlled perception, and allowed the design to unfold while remaining invisible. The missing blade, the reactions to repetition, the small custhi were your handiwork, your genius concealed behind another's boldness. Japp growled, stepping forward. "So we've only scratched the surface? All this time we were focused on the wrong person." Poirot nodded gently. "The truth is seldom simple, Inspector. Appearances deceive. The mind capable of constructing such intricate deception may not wish to be seen. And tonight, the final revelation confirms that the danger was never truly contained." Miss Carter's defiance faltered, as she now realized her freedom to act had always been under someone else's careful supervision. Lady Margaret's composure cracked further, as the weight of exposure descended like a blade sharper than any steel. Poirot's gaze swept the room, calm, precise, all pieces now accounted for. "The case," he said softly, "is resolved in part, but the mind behind the mind has yet to be fully confronted. And until that final act is performed, the story is not yet complete." The air thickened, tension coiling tighter. The seemingly concluded evening had revealed its last, most unsettling truth. The true mastermind had been hiding in plain sight all along, and even Poirot's unparalleled observation would be tested to the very limit before the case reached its final, undeniable conclusion. Poirot's gaze did not waver, calm and unshakable, as the room held its collective breath. The tension, which had been taut like a drawn bow for hours, now hovered at the precipice of revelation. Lady Margaret's hands had begun to tremble slightly, her serene mask shattered, while Miss Carter sat defeated, aware that her bold deception had been manipulated by a hand she had not fully understood. Hastings and Japp exchanged worried glances, sensing that the evening's resolution was not yet complete. "Now, mes amis," Poirot said, his voice soft but authoritative, "we come to the final clarification. Every action, every signal, every hesitation tonight was observed, catalogued, and understood." But what some of you may not realize is how meticulously the deception was constructed, not only to mislead, but to test human perception itself. He moved slowly toward Lady Margaret, the floorboards whispering under his measured steps. "Madame, You believed that by guiding Miss Carter, by orchestrating her boldness, you would remain invisible. And indeed, for a time, you succeeded. Every removed blade, every staged attack, every repeated gesture at the tablefy were all your design. Lady Margaret's lips parted, her composure gone. I only intended to ensure things went correctly. She would have ruined everything. Poirot inclined his head. Ah, yes, that is precisely the problem. The intention was to control, and yet control itself demanded risk. You underestimated the observation of those around you. The subtle tremor in Miss Carter's hand when she mimed the wine, the minute twitch of Dr. Renfield's fingers, even the repeated realignments of your own silverware was a message, a tell, that only the trained eye could read. Japp stepped forward. So she really was the one pulling the strings. The mastermind. We, Inspector. The visible culprit performed the acts, but the invisible mind directed the symphony of deception. A partnership, yes, but one mind operating behind the other, calculating, manipulating, and testing reactions. And that, mes amis, is why Miss Carter seemed daring yet constrained, bold yet predictable. Hastings shook his head, incredulous. So justice will reach her, and... Poirot paused, hands clasped behind his back. His eyes swept the room, noting every reaction, every subtle movement. Justice, as one might hope, is delivered to Miss Carter. She has confessed under observation, constrained by her own design and the meticulous attention of those she sought to manipulate. Yet the true architect Lady Margaret escapes formal punishment tonight. She remains free, though her guilt is not hidden from us. One can see, can understand, can anticipate. Yet the law is not always immediate in its grasp. A silence fell, heavy with unease. Japp frowned. So she gets away. Poirot shook his head slightly, almost imperceptibly. She escapes in form, yes, but not in recognition. The truth is clear to those who observe carefully. And that, Inspector, is the difference between surface justice and complete understanding. He stepped toward the center of the room, allowing his gaze to sweep over every guest once more. Notice, if you will, the clues that many missed, the repeated gestures, the hesitation in speech, the carefully measured gaze. The stolen blade was a signal, the attack on the butler a probe, and the small patterns missed by all but the most observant revealed the orchestrator's hand. Miss Carter was the tool, Lady Margaret, the mind. Hastings exhaled heavily. So everything we thought we knew, it was just the surface. Exactly, mon ami, Poirot said, calm as ever, a slight smile tracing his lips. The visible crime was only the tip of the iceberg. The deeper truth psychology, the orchestration, the hidden motives was always present, waiting for observation, for deduction. And that is why the mind of the detective must always be several steps ahead of the deceiver. Miss Carter's gaze dropped, defeated. Lady Margaret, still seated, met Poirot's eyes for a moment, and in that instant, acknowledgment passed between Thema, silent recognition of exposure without recourse. The room, tense and charged for hours, finally settled, though unease lingered like a shadow. Poirot moved toward the window, letting the last flickers of the evening light illuminate his serene expression. And so, justice has been served, or escaped, depending upon one's perspective. But for those who observe, who think, who notice the smallest details, the truth is always revealed. That, mes amis, is the power of reason, observation, and the careful study of human behavior. As the night deepened outside, the guests remained seated, some in relief, some in quiet horror, while Poirot, ever composed, considered the intricate dance of deception and revelation that had just unfolded. For even in victory, the mind of the detective knows, the shadows of cunning rarely vanish entirely, simply wait for another observer to notice. The house had quieted, though not completely. The flickering firelight still cast long, shifting shadows across the walls, painting the room in shades of unease and reflection. Guests moved slowly, murmuring in low tones, processing the revelation of the evening. Miss Carter had been escorted to await questioning, Lady Margaret remained poised yet unsettled, and the rest of the household lingered, dazed by the layers of deception that had been unravelled. Poirot stood near the doorway, hands clasped neatly behind him, surveying the aftermath with his usual serenity. Yet beneath the calm exterior, his mind was already sifting through every nuance, every overlooked gesture. Even after hours of observation, the smallest inconsistencies had a way of whispering their secrets only to the most attentive mind. Inspector Japp approached, his expression a mixture of admiration and exasperation. "Well, Poirot, I have to admit I thought we had it all figured out when Miss Carter confessed, and now you're saying the real mastermind was someone else entirely. You make it sound so simple." Poirot allowed a faint smile. "Ah, Inspector, simple it is never. But clarity, is always attainable for the mind that observes without haste and deduces without prejudice. And yet—" His eyes flicked subtly toward the table, toward the polished silverware, toward the corners of the room where shadows clung. "Even now, there is a detail that does not align completely. A minor inconsistency in timing, a shadow unaccounted for, a slight hesitation in speech that I cannot yet explain fully." Japp frowned. "You mean there's another layer?" "Perhaps," Poirot said softly, almost to himself, "or perhaps it is a signal. A whisper from the future, if one is sufficiently attuned. The mystery of human behavior is inexhaustible. One uncovers one thread, and immediately another appears, teasing the mind, demanding attention." Hastings, standing nearby, shifted uneasily. "You mean there could be more?" Poirot's eyes twinkled with that peculiar light that suggested both certainty and wonder. Hastings. The perfection of crime is not merely in its execution, but in its capacity to endure in the mind of the observer. Even when justice appears served, even when the visible culprit is apprehended, subtle signs remain. A misplaced handkerchief, an unfinished letter, a glance that avoids the obvious. These are the seeds of the next investigation. Lady Margaret, standing with her composed demeanor now slightly frayed, observed him in silence, a flicker of awareness crossing her face. Poirot's gaze met hers, calm but probing, as if acknowledging that some truths are never fully contained. He moved toward the door, his steps measured, deliberate. Japp and Hastings followed, the echo of their boots on the polished floor marking the transition from revelation to departure. The household behind them was still alive with quiet tension, the aftermath of a complex dance of deceit, but Poirot's mind had already moved ahead, chasing the faintest threads that might connect tonight's events to those yet unseen. As he stepped outside into the night, the cool air brushed against his face, carrying the faint scent of autumn and the distant sound of rustling leaves. He paused for a moment, eyes lifting toward the stars above, and allowed himself a small, contemplative smile. Even in apparent resolution, the mind of the detective must remain alert. A detail overlooked, a whisper missed, a shadow unaccounted for, all of these are invitations to the next puzzle, the next challenge. Japp, following close behind, muttered, "You always make it sound like the game's never over." "Precisely, mon ami," Poirot replied, calm and confident, "because the game never is. Human nature, like mystery, is infinite. One thread is unraveled, and immediately another presents itself, waiting to be observed, to be understood, to be revealed." Hastings glanced back toward the house, the dark windows reflecting the firelight like distant eyes. "Do you ever rest, Poirot?" Poirot chuckled softly, a low, measured sound. "Rest, oui, but only to sharpen the mind. Because even when one case is concluded, there is always another. A whisper in the night, a shadow in the corner of perception, a secret that refuses to be contained. And thus, the mystery never ends." The three men walked down the gravel path, their figures illuminated by the pale moonlight. Behind them, the house remained silent, yet poised, as if it too were aware that the evening's revelations were only part of a greater, unseen story. And for Poirot, that knowledge was both a burden and a delight, for the mind that observes never truly rests, and the next mystery was already waiting, just beyond the horizon.